All right, let's get right into it. The 1990s, the Soviet Union is gone, and the whole world is basically holding its breath, trying to figure out what happens next. And right at the heart of it all, you've got two guys, US President Bill Clinton and Russia's first ever president, Boris Yeltsin. Their relationship really shaped one of the most chaotic and honestly crucial decades in modern history.
So let's set the scene. It's January 1996. We're in Russia, it's an election year, and President Boris Yeltsin is staring down a political catastrophe. The country's a mess. The economy's in crisis, crime is through the roof, and the war in Chechnya is just a total disaster.
So how bad was it? I mean, really bad? This bad. 6%. That was Boris Yeltsin's approval rating. Just 6. To put that in perspective, polls at the time show that Joseph Stalin, yes, that Stalin, was actually more popular with the Russian public. Yeltsin wasn't just on the ropes, he was political toast. So this is the big question, right? How in the world does a leader with a 6% approval rating manage to pull off a huge victory just half a year later? Well, that's the wild story of his impossible campaign, and it had massive consequences for Russia and for the rest of us. Okay, but to really get why 1996 was such a nail-biter, we have to rewind just a little bit to the early 90s. The Cold War is over. For the first time in basically 2 generations, an American president doesn't have to build his entire foreign policy around the Soviet Union. This new era was all about the partnership between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, what people started calling the Bill and Boris show. But, this wasn't some easy victory lap. As Clinton himself pointed out in his very first inaugural address, just because the big superpower conflict was over, it didn't mean conflict itself was over. All sorts of new challenges were already bubbling up from the ashes of that old world. And get this, the number of times these two actually met is just staggering. Bill and Boris got together 18 times while they were in office. That's almost as many meetings as all their predecessors had during the entire Cold War combined. Clinton became so involved that his own top Russia expert called him the US government's principal Russia hand. And this wasn't just for show. They actually got stuff done. At their very first summit, the US promised money to help Russia's new fragile democracy. They worked together on the huge task of taking apart the old Soviet nuclear arsenal. And this was a big push from Clinton. Russia was invited to join the G7, turning it into the G8. That was a huge deal, a really powerful symbol that Russia was being treated like a partner, not some defeated enemy. But all that optimism, well, it was about to hit a brick wall. That partnership was about to face its biggest test yet, the 1996 Russian presidential election. And believe me, this wasn't just some domestic vote. Everyone saw it as a make-or-break moment for Russia's future, and you can bet the US was watching very, very closely. Just look at these polls from early 96. It was a complete disaster for Yeltsin. He wasn't just trailing, he was getting absolutely crushed. His biggest rival, the communist leader Gennady Zyuganov, was successfully tapping into this deep sense of nostalgia for the old, stable Soviet days. Even the far-right nationalist Vladimir Zhirinovsky was polling ahead of him. The sitting president was in dead last. So you can imagine the panic in Yeltsin's campaign headquarters. Their first strategy, which was basically trying to sound as tough as the nationalists, was a total failure. They needed a radical change. And here's the pivot. They decided to basically manufacture a two-man race. They were going to convince every single voter that there were only 2 real choices, Yeltsin or a terrifying return to the communist past. And the slogan they came up with? Wow. Vote or lose. It's simple, it's stark, and it was brutally effective. This wasn't a positive, here's our vision for the future kind of message. No, this was a threat. The message was crystal clear. A vote for anyone other than Yeltsin is a vote for the communists, and if they win, you lose everything. So then the campaign got a very powerful ally on its side, the media. See, Russia's new business oligarchs, who now own the TV stations, were terrified. A communist victory could mean losing their new empires. So they threw everything they had behind Yeltsin. The news coverage became incredibly one-sided. National TV just hammered this message home day in and day out, giving Yeltsin more than half of all the candidate airtime. And of course, Yeltsin used every tool the presidency gave him. A massive $10 billion IMF loan conveniently arrived right before the election, which let the government suddenly start paying all the back wages and pensions it had owed people for months. He fired a bunch of unpopular officials. The campaign even organized these huge rock concerts to get young anti-communist voters to the polls. The full power of the state, backed by those oligarchs, was all in for Yeltsin. So did it work? Well, barely. In that first round, Yeltsin just squeaked by with a tiny 3-point lead. But the really important number on this chart is the third one. The guy in third place, a tough-talking general named Alexander Lebed, got almost 15% of the vote. And now, his supporters were basically the kingmakers who would decide Russia's future. So this sets the stage for a dramatic, high-stakes runoff election. The campaign was far from over, and the victory, when it finally came, would really mark the beginning of a whole new and much more difficult chapter in Russia's relationship with the West. Okay, so how'd they seal the deal in the end? Well, first, Yeltsin cut a deal with General Lebed, making him his national security chief in exchange for his much-needed endorsement. But then, disaster strikes. Yeltsin has a massive heart attack and completely disappears from public view. His team had to scramble, and they literally created a virtual Yeltsin, using old video clips and pre-taped interviews to make it look like he was still campaigning. And amazingly, it worked. Yeltsin won the final round, and pretty decisively too. But here's the thing. After that election, the Bill and Boris partnership really started to fracture. The US and its allies moved to expand NATO eastward, right up to Russia's borders, which Moscow saw as a huge threat. Then NATO bombed Serbia, one of Russia's oldest allies. And in return, Russia launched a second, even more brutal war in Chechnya. The paths of Russia and the West were now going in very different directions. And that brings us to the final act of the decade. With his health getting worse and his popularity back in the dumps, Boris Yeltsin had one last surprise for his country and for the world. On the very last day of the 20th century, December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin gets on television and announces he's resigning. He actually asked the Russian people for forgiveness and said it was time for a new generation to take the reins. And that new generation would be led by his hand-picked successor, a former KGB agent named Vladimir Putin. So how do we look back on him now? His legacy is, to put it mildly, deeply divided. I mean, on the one hand, this is the guy who gave Russia its first ever democratic elections in 1,000 years and a new constitution. But on the other hand, his 1996 victory basically wrote the playbook for what people now call managed democracy, using state resources, media control, and friendly oligarchs to guarantee a win. It was a playbook his successor would go on to perfect. And that leaves us with the final, crucial question that historians are still arguing about today. Was Boris Yeltsin a flawed Democrat who, despite all his mistakes, saved his country from sliding back into communism? Or was he a leader who, in that desperate fight to survive, ended up damaging the very democracy he helped create and maybe even paved the way for the Russia we see today?